Welcome to CSIS Online. Join us as we bring together top experts and thought leaders to discuss innovative ideas and real-world solutions to global issues, from security and economics to technology and environment. Tune in and be part of the conversation.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm Bill Whyman, and I'm delighted to host this panel of world-class experts on competition for trustworthy cloud computing. First, a quick note on the organization of today's session. I'll make a few introductory comments just to set the stage. Then I'll introduce our panel. The panel will share some views and respond to questions, and we'll then turn to audience Q&A. So please submit your questions, and we'll wrap up in about an hour. I want to give a big thanks to Jim Lewis, the Strategic Technology Programs, and CSIS for supporting this research. CSIS recently published a report making the case that building trustworthy cloud computing to be an economic development and foreign policy priority for democratic nations, and it focuses on the Latin American experience. Now, it argues that cloud is a strategic driver of economic growth and national security. Macroeconomic level, cloud drives growth, it drives job creation, it drives productivity. And on a micro level, cloud is a platform for innovation. It drives efficiency, resiliency, and economic competitiveness. And there's lots of examples and data of that in the report. In short, those countries that adopt cloud computing will be more successful in the global economy, while countries that are slow to adopt cloud are likely to fall behind. Now, cloud is also strategic from a national security perspective. Disruption of the integrity, the confidentiality, or the availability of cloud infrastructure can cause great damage. And there's petabytes, that's lots, of sensitive data residing in the cloud. Hence, cloud is becoming a focal point for strategic competition among countries. So again, that's competition among countries, not just among companies. Now, China sees the strategic importance of cloud and is supporting its cloud providers overseas while protecting the cloud market inside China. And China seeks to be Latin America's leading economic provider and leading supplier of digital technologies, including cloud. China is courting favor in Latin America via economic assistance and commercial diplomacy. And while this can be attractive to buyers on the short term, what we've seen is that it opens up a Pandora's box. Untrustworthy cloud infrastructures create dependencies, vulnerabilities, data privacy challenges, and security concerns. And we've encountered some of these issues in a similar way in 5G wireless equipment. Now, further, this threatens the political and economic interests of the United States and like-minded partners. And just as importantly, it creates challenges for host countries in Latin America and elsewhere. Economic dependencies, security vulnerabilities, and concerns about data confidentiality are already surfacing. And this in turn slows the adoption of cloud computing and denies Latin America the many benefits of cloud. So the CSIS paper proposes a 6-part plan to achieve trustworthy cloud computing in partnership with Latin America. And ideally, this could be part of a joint US-Latin American initiative, such as the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity. Now, our expert panel today is going to help us unpack these issues and explore solutions. So I'm excited to introduce them to you. In alphabetical order, Steve Lang. Steve is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Information and Communications Policy, and he is really at the nexus of policymaking on cyberspace and digital policy. Relevant to our topic today, he has served in senior positions in the U.S. Embassy in Mexico, as well as Deputy Director of the China Desk at State and the U.S. Consulate in Guangzhou. Jonathan McHale is Vice President for Digital Trade at the Computer and Communications Industry Association. He was Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Digital Trade, and he has 2 decades of experience working to open foreign markets in the telecom and tech sectors, both at the State Department and USTR. He was also the lead negotiator for the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Digital Trade Chapter, among others. And Antonio Garcia Zaballos is the lead telecom specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank. He co-authored the IDB book, Cloud Computing, Opportunities for and Challenges for Sustainable Economic Development in Latin America. And previously, he was the chief economist at Telefónica of Spain and deputy director of the economics and markets at the Spanish telecom regulator. So we've got a great panel, and let's dive in. I'm going to kick things off by asking Steve Lang. Steve, can you just set the table a little bit more in terms of what are the core issues from the State Department's view, and why is this so important to the U.S. government?
Thanks, Bill. And first of all, thanks for the opportunity to join this great panel on what is really an important topic that is increasingly a focus for us at the State Department. First, I'll just emphasize that the administration has a positive vision of digital technologies that, as President Biden said at the UN, uplifts and empowers people, that creates new opportunities for individuals and businesses in a healthy, competitive environment, and that respects human rights and freedom of expression. Now, secure and trustworthy telecommunications networks globally are critical to enabling societies to take advantage of the incredible benefits of meaningful connectivity, and promoting network security is a high priority for the Biden administration. I think most of the audience is already aware that manufacturers and developers of modern ICT equipment retain access to most devices and software after the end user purchases them to provide new features, updates, patches for vulnerabilities, to track diagnostics and crash reports and more. And as with many developments in technology today, this has potential for huge benefits to the user, but also for abuse. And while any connected device could conceivably become a threat vector in the hands of an untrusted supplier, critical infrastructure such as 5G and future mobile wireless networks, undersea cables, data centers, and cloud computing, our topic for today, which requires planning and significant investments carried out over years, are of particular importance. So we at the State Department have often raised 5G and are increasingly looking at cloud, our topic for today. But truly, a comprehensive approach must be taken, and that's what we started doing at State. Untrusted suppliers subject to the control of authoritarian regimes can be compelled in secret to manipulate, disrupt, or otherwise serve the interests of these regimes that have no regard for privacy or human rights. And high-risk, untrusted suppliers beholden to the whims of these authoritarian governments without realistic legal recourse present significant risks to our modern interconnected technology ecosystem. And they represent the ultimate insider threat. Their unique access and inside knowledge of their hardware and software gives them unprecedented access. And with cloud, we have to consider the risk of untrusted supply, both in terms of the cloud service providers themselves and the equipment that they use. So as countries seek to develop vibrant technology and innovation ecosystems to seize the promises of the digital economy, they should build that on the solid foundation of trustworthy ICT infrastructure from 5G to cloud and beyond. And that's the message we're trying to deliver at the State Department.
Hey, thank you, Steve, for putting that in context. Now, you mentioned, the broad tech ecosystem and other technologies that are part of that. Let me ask you a follow-up on, you mentioned 5G and 6G and other that are coming. Some of the issues with 5G also are present around cloud. What did the U.S. government learn around the effort to bring trustworthiness to 5G networks? And what are the lessons that might apply to cloud computing, both from the U.S. side, but also how do we bring our partners along so that they understand both the challenges and the benefits?
Yeah, we've learned quite a few lessons, what has worked and what hasn't, and we continue to learn more as we seek to expand the range of tools that we have to promote trustworthy infrastructure. Cloud, 5G, other ICT critical infrastructure is different from historical examples of critical infrastructure. I mean, now it's not just steel and concrete and asphalt. It's immensely complex, and it's often usually connected to the internet. ICT infrastructure, it includes complex hardware, software, firmware that functions inside a device, and understanding how they all interact with each other and with other hardware and software components is often difficult. And understanding how the updates and patches interact with all of that adds a whole nother layer of complexity and risk. So along these lines, it's not enough to raise security concerns at a high level. We've continuously adapted and refined our messaging, both in public statements and in private meetings and communications, to address concerns or questions our colleagues in other countries have. And often they may be aware of the security concerns, but view the decision as, and we've usually been engaging up till now on 5G networks. So they often view it as a choice between untrusted 5G or no 5G at all, which really leads to my next point, which is that cost is a key consideration, and not just for developing countries, but also for mobile network operators justifying their expenses to shareholders. So this is why we work to promote a vibrant and diverse ecosystem of trustworthy suppliers and support developments that increase network openness and interoperability and supply diversity. For example, we support Open RAN development because it reduces vendor lock-in in 5G networks and increases the variety of suppliers for the telecommunications ecosystem. And now, fortunately for cloud services, there are several large trusted suppliers that are industry leaders and very competitive globally. But there was previously a diverse field of suppliers in wireless network equipment as well, and that has really consolidated over the years. So we want to raise important awareness about the importance of trusted supply and cloud services now to help ensure that we continue to have diversity and trusted supply options in the future.
Thank you, Steve. Jonathan, let me turn that to you. You've negotiated a lot of these agreements. I know you're getting a lot of feedback from industry and do consultations overseas. I don't know if you want to add to kind of what lessons do you think we've learned from 5G, but what are your thoughts on recommendations to improve trustworthy cloud computing solutions? Are there particular leverage points that you think are most effective? And I'll tee one up for you because I know you've been involved in this. Government procurement and public procurement, so not just the formal government, but quasi-public agencies. How important is this a leverage, and what specifics do you have or would you suggest around to help create trustworthy cloud? Jonathan, on mute.
Sorry, thanks for the invitation and for participating. Great panel. First, what's at stake for industry? I mean, this is one of the most important shifts in technology since the birth of the internet. I mean, it's opened up broad new advances in applications, more efficient government and private sector services. And it's one of the foundational technologies for artificial intelligence. You're not going to have artificial intelligence unless you have robust cloud computing supporting it. Looking back at the 5G example, I think is really interesting because there's a lot of parallels. Captive market in China, in this case, a lot of government funding of a national champion to get out into foreign markets through what's called the digital Silk Road, and a lot of government funding for that, and the similar security concern, which is access to the activities of those companies through essentially through lack of a rule of law approach in the host country, where the government can compel access in ways that democracies certainly one couldn't. In terms of the leverage, points of leverage, you mentioned government procurement. I think that's really one of the prime drivers in this space. Government's often a first actor in this space. I think it was in the US, we adopted the so-called cloud first approach, and I think it was a catalyst for expanding cloud computing generally throughout the economy. That tends not to be subject to trade rules in many countries. In many it does, and in Europe it does, and in Europe they're probably in violation of that through some of the certification programs that they're currently envisaging. I think in the Latin America context, the good news is they're pretty open to cloud computing. So if you look at, not on the government procurement side, but on the commercial sphere, through trade rules, they've basically said we are open for business. We will allow companies to offer the service both if you want to invest in country or on a cross-border basis. On the cross-border basis, really important, and that does get to the issue of data localization, but put that to the side. I think the challenge is, as Steve mentioned, unlike in 5G, where we said this is trustworthy, don't do it, but we didn't have necessarily a clear alternative to offer to governments that we thought would be interested in investing in 5G. Here we do, right? I mean, in a way, we came too late to the 5G party. Motorola had been sold off. Lucent was also in the process of being taken over. So our network equipment industry was pretty much under siege. Here, we're at the beginning, so we can avoid that eventuality. But some government support would be useful in helping the companies push back against subsidized loans, for example, and more awareness on how to evaluate the security concerns that an untrustworthy supplier could have in your market.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. You raised a lot of issues, and we're going to come back to unpeel some of those. But both of you have addressed the cost issues. Antonio, I want to ask you, in many Latin American countries, they're aware of the security issues, but economics also play a great role. And maybe you can share some perspectives on how you think different countries, or if you want to kind of generalize across, how is that evaluation made between having to address both the security issues and the economic issues? And are there any insights that we could use to kind of craft tools or solutions that respond to the need to hit both the economic and the security concerns?
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you for the invitation to be here in this great panel. The question, it is more than just a trade-off, in my view. It is like a clear understanding on what are the different variables that a government are keeping in mind anytime when they are deciding whether to go to cloud or not. Among any others, we may say, okay, of course, there is an issue related to infrastructure security. No doubt about that. But it's not just about the infrastructure security, which is the immediate thing that comes to the mind of everybody. It is also about data privacy. It's about how we are going to guarantee that the information is somehow protected. So the very beginning, Steve was mentioning one word that I totally agree, which is how we are going to protect the infrastructure that is critical. And I will say that in many countries in Latin America, the challenge is not just about how to protect the infrastructure as such, but it's also how we are going to protect the information that is flowing through that infrastructure. So having a particular strategy on critical information infrastructure protection is going to be critical whenever that we are thinking about going cloud. But also, one of the biggest concerns that I had the opportunity to discuss with authorities from different countries, like in Ecuador, El Salvador, or Argentina, is about the continuity of the service. So needless to say that there are still a lot of, awareness that needs to be created across civil servants, officials, about the benefits that cloud could bring beyond cost. So in here, most of the risks that the governments are seeing are basically a problem related to redundancy. I mean, and along with that, how we are going to guarantee that there is a existing infrastructure that is related to the data that somehow is going to be able to guarantee that the data, that the information that is flowing eventually is going to not to be lost. So, and along with this, of course, there are some soft things that are needed, like for instance, the regulatory framework and the policies that are also needed. The data classification, whenever that we are deciding about this particular type of decisions, one of the biggest concerns that many governments are putting on top of the table are those related to, okay, and what is going to happen with the information that is up in the cloud? Is it subject to cyber attacks? Can I just put all the information that I have from my citizens? Do I have to do a data classification, understanding that there are certain level of the different confidentiality associated to the different information? So all those are part of the trade-off as well. And this is what eventually is making one government going towards one particular decision or another one, but making sure that they do have the infrastructure, the digital skills that are required, and also the policy framework.
So thank you. And I heard at least 4 or 5 different variables. So I think that's helpful because it gets it out of, a binary, cheap or secure. And, you have to choose one or the other and you can't get both. And I think you articulately laid out that it's more complicated than that. And there are ways to structure, packages that meet multiple of those concerns. If I can follow up, the IDB is on the front lines of this, and I imagine as part of any multilateral initiative would be a key partner. What kind of tools does the IDB have to address some of these things, whether it's sector-based funding, technical assistance? I mean, you mentioned a couple of things around, awareness and education. How do you think the IDB specifically, but maybe more broadly, the multilateral development institutions and country assistance programs can help kind of address some of these issues to get to a secure and economic?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Bill. So I will just mention about 3 different financial products that we do have. Of course, first, and the clearest one is the one related to investment loans, where we are precisely supporting the governments either in the deployment of the infrastructure or on the acquisition of those services related to the cloud. But again, that needs to be part of the priorities that the government do have in relationship with the different MDBs and particularly with the Inter-American Development Bank. Second product is definitely technical cooperation. I think that this is a critical instrument that is going to make sure that the governments are prepared from a policy standpoint, I mean, the regulatory standpoint, but also in terms of the governance model that is needed in order for this initiative to move forward. One of the biggest challenges that we are facing when we are talking about digitalization in the region is that we don't have a clear champion. So we may have one specific minister that is dealing with a particular type of services, like Minister of Education, then we have the Minister of Health, sometimes we have Minister of Telecommunications, sometimes even at the President office there is a particular person that is in charge of some digital agenda, but there is a lack of clear leadership in the governance model to make sure that there is a centralized and there is a way in which the provision of a public service are somehow provided in an efficient way. And that is precisely why technical cooperation are very powerful instruments, because we can support them on issues related to how to organize themselves, on issues related to policy regulation, or even, how to bring particular experiences from different governments, like for instance, the United States, or the case of Spain, or the case of Korea, that they are important donors to the IDB. And last but not least, the third type of product is what we call policy-based loans, which is very important because let's say the beneficiary, even though it's the whole society, let's say the executing agency is not going to be a sector minister, it's going to be the finance minister that is receiving that money, always that the sector minister has been able to modify the policy framework that is required for this particular, for instance, innovative solution to really take place in the country. So those are different financial instruments that we can provide. Even we can just think about a combination of some of them, depending on the appetite of the countries.
Thank you, Antonio. Steve, let me push it back to you or pick up on his remarks, because the IDB and the MDBs at the end of the day get funding from the G7. So my question to you is, this would seem to fit very nicely with things like the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. I know the US and the EU are now starting to jointly fund secure ICT around the world. So my question to you is, to what extent can the US lead, whether it's G7 or whether it's other natural groupings, kind of a multilateral initiative around this, and how much funding is realistic? Obviously, it's not the only issue, but it seems that that's going to be a necessary part of. Can you share with us some thoughts, prospects for kind of multilateral action? It's always more effective if you can. And what are the prospects for funding?
Sure, Bill, and that's a good question. Joint funding with our partners, joint financing with our partners is something that we've been working hard on. And the United States and the European Commission are working through the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, actively coordinating on funding for ICT projects. I guess I need to note that it's the US government, our funding is limited. And I should note that joint funding, joint financing, where we're both contributing or loaning money to the same project is kind of the most advanced type of cooperation we can do. Sometimes it can also be effective for one partner to finance or provide funding for something, and another partner to provide a feasibility study or technical assistance that goes along with it, and to combine forces based on strengths like that. And sometimes it can just be helpful for us to compare notes on where we're operating and try to make sure that we're complementing each other and not overlapping the efforts that we're trying to achieve. And I guess I'll note that financing for these technologies is definitely key, but beyond loans and letters of credit, insurance, other similar financial tools available, we also spend a lot of time and energy on things like training, upskilling, and human capital development, policy and regulatory assistance and reform, technical legal assistance, and other activities that we feel are also very important for building that trustworthy foundation for the future digital economy and for helping to convince and educate our partners on the importance of this. So in this way, we're really aiming to amplify the impact of financing for projects. And there are some really good examples of areas where we are cooperating with our partners. For example, the United States and Japan are cooperating through the US-led Open RAN Academy in the Philippines. And this is a US-Japan endeavor in which each partner is bringing different strengths to the table. And it's been so successful that USAID is looking to expand it into other regions as well.
I'm really glad you brought up the training and technical assistance in addition to the funding, because that's an issue everywhere. It's not a Latin America issue or an Asia issue. It's a U.S. issue. Cloud is new enough and a changed enough model that everyone is trying to build skills around this. Please.
I was just going to say, if I could add just one more point. Policy is also really critical in this, and you mentioned the G7. And in the G7, we're working closely with Japan and our other colleagues to advance digital free flow with trust, which we're working to incorporate into an institutional arrangement for partnership. And the free flow of data is really vital to scaling cloud services and ensuring that cloud service providers have the tools that they need to transfer data. And Jonathan referred to some initiatives that the EU is looking at. And that's another place where we're engaging on the types of policies that are going to enable cloud services across borders.
Thank you for that, addendum. Here kind of, again, multiple tools that have to be addressed. Funding will be key. Let's pick up on a couple of the areas. So Jonathan, let me turn it back to you now. Steve brought up kind of two. So one, training and assistance. Industry plays a big role in this. And I know some of your members are already active kind of in training, but can you share kind of what role you think industry has? And I don't know whether it's a formal public-private partnership, but what role industry can have in training? And then maybe we can turn to Steve brought up the policy issues, and particularly around free flow of data. I'll come back to you on that one.
Sure. So about 5 years ago, I went to Thailand and was asking the Thais what he thought as in government, what could be done to advance cooperation in the digital space. And one of the things the Thai said is the Japanese put a lot of money into helping train us in cybersecurity. And I thought that was interesting because one of the things that we did through trade, it was at a request from the White House to see if you can't do something in the trade space that's cybersecurity related. We had to work with a lot of U.S. agencies. DHS, it turns out, does run the computer emergency response teams. Their goal is to alert both the public and private sector on when malware is detected and how to identify it and mitigate against it. And so that was something we actually folded into the trade disciplines, an agreement to cooperate between certs, because most countries around the world do have these computer emergency response teams, but some are better trained than others. I think the thing that the private sector does is a lot of the certification for knowledge about the specific standards that help protect networks against malware. And how to report it, how to ensure that it doesn't happen in the past. So one of the things that U.S. companies have been highly involved in is, for example, the NIST cybersecurity framework, which really has been a public-private partnership between goals that the government has on protecting networks and having companies actually implement something in a voluntary manner, but in a way that responds to the broader policy goals. So that experience is something companies bring into the markets in which they serve and in which the local staff end up absorbing and becoming cyber experts in their own right, either through training services that the companies themselves provide or that they fund through third-party organizations.
Do you think, from your experience, that the banks would partner with industry on the training, and that the host countries would be open to offers of training and technical assistance as part of a broader solution? How do you think that would be perceived? Does that matter?
Absolutely. I think that the digital skills is definitely one of the key challenges that we are facing in Latin America. I like to say that it is not just a matter related to access, but also it's a matter related to adoption and use. And to guarantee that there is a proper adoption and a proper use, we need to define a specific digital skills program according to the digital maturity level that every country is facing. So for us, recently, precisely, we have launched a specific strategy on digital skills that we are intending to implement in different countries across Latin America, again, depending on the level of digital maturity. One size doesn't fit all. One thing that we have learned is that, depending exactly on what is the level of development, of digital development that the country do have, and depending as well on the specific target population that you want to train, there should be a specific training program related to that. So, for instance, these days we are working with El Salvador, with Dominican Republic, and Argentina in specific training programs that are intended to increase the level of adoption and usage. And what we start doing is precisely first like an assessment and a classification on what is the level of digital development of different social strata, and keeping that in mind, we define the different level of digital skills, basics, advanced, or intermediate, based on the specific requirements that the people have. Another important thing to bring into the equation when we are talking about training is the gender component. You know, one thing, and I remember that at the very beginning you were mentioning about the socioeconomic impact that cloud may bring. I would like to talk about the socioeconomic impact that digitalization may bring into the Latin America and the Caribbean countries. And in that particular regard, we need to bring women into the labor force, and training of women with a particular purpose is going to be critical if we just want to guarantee an organic increment in terms of GDP thanks to that particular training. So we are totally in with this particular initiative, and is both part of technical assistance and also part of investment loan that we are at the moment executing.
Thank you. It's such an important point, because if it's not inclusive, if it doesn't help bring the benefits broadly to the economy and to citizens, then support for these kinds of innovation get harder and harder. So encouraging to hear your positive response there. And I always find that the education is part and parcel of so many of these issues. So for example, the data privacy and procurement issues that were referenced earlier, I want to follow up on those. These seem, can be seen particularly nettlesome. So data privacy, a lot of countries are very concerned about this, and it seems like there's a lot of appeal around data localization as kind of a first kind of immediate response to this issue. And the education around that has to kind of go in cycles to unpack those issues. I'm going to go to Jonathan on this one, and then maybe back to Steve and Antonio. We see a lot of countries initially grabbing at data localization as a solution. Can you give us your thoughts on whether you think that's a real solution or a good solution? And are there other ways to achieve those goals that might be more effective?
Yeah. When the US government pushed their cloud first policy way back in the Obama administration, one of the first things they did was try and reduce the number of data centers. Why? Because each data center is they call it a vector of attack, an attack surface that exposes broader assets to more malicious actors. So one of the myths is that having your own data center makes you more secure, when in reality, security often operates at scale as well. So what you may want is the company that has invested most in security to be the one that is holding your data. It may not be in your country. As a matter of fact, requiring data localization and opening up another surface of attack could actually harm both cybersecurity and the privacy that attaches to it. So I think that's really a critical thing to keep in mind, is that localization certainly doesn't solve the security issue, and I would argue it doesn't solve the privacy issue as well. I think on the privacy issue, the challenge has been that countries all around the world have different privacy laws. And, Peru told me, look, I want to make sure that the data complies with my law, and therefore I want to keep it in my country. What we have seen, though, over the past decade is the companies are pretty good at enabling protections to travel with the data. So even if a law in a particular country doesn't require encryption or require some of the other mechanisms used to protect privacy, the company can do that, and the company can commit to doing that as part of its engagement in that country. And, so that's the premise of what was just announced, thank God, with the European Union to enable data to move into the US, even in the absence of in exactly the same privacy law. The companies commit to protect it as it is required to be protected in the European Union. So I don't think privacy argument really holds. And I think on the security side, governments really need to think long and hard about aren't you better off with some world-class security protections that a company could provide that are different than you yourself hosting data within the basement of your government building.
So I find that compelling, but Steve, it's your job to actually engage governments around with, I imagine, similar arguments. What have you found to be some of the more compelling arguments around these issues? And maybe on the flip side, what are you finding to be kind of the commonly held, I won't call them misbeliefs, but views that maybe are widely held in Latin America and around the world that you think are counterproductive to actually achieving true security and a trustworthy cloud?
Really, Jonathan was using some of the same talking points that we use on how cloud is actually often more secure if it's not localized. And in addition, I mean, this is just maybe not a huge difference in that. In addition to the cybersecurity focus, there's just the general resiliency argument that, if there's a natural disaster or some other kind of network failure, that not having your data all localized in one place in your country can really be an advantage. We promote those arguments. We also are often trying to make sure that we educate about privacy laws in the United States. There's misunderstanding about that. And we want to make sure that folks know that there are strong protections for privacy and data in the United States as well. In addition, one of our top priorities is to promote interoperability among privacy legislation, privacy rules and frameworks. Because different countries are going to have different historical perspectives, different cultural notions of privacy. And so I don't think we're going to get to a place where everybody's following the same model like the GDPR or something like that. And we want to make sure that we have tools like the US-EU data privacy framework, that we have other tools that companies can use, like model contract clauses or similar tools. And of course, we are very active in the State Department and Department of Commerce in promoting the global, the cross-border privacy, the Global Cross-Border Privacy Rules Forum, which came out of APEC and is another tool or system to allow companies to be able to move data across borders.
So thank you again. To an American audience, that may sound reasonable. Antonio, you're working with these countries, and the IDB's mission is development. Do you think those arguments are compelling? Do you think they kind of square the circle between providing mechanisms to achieve trustworthiness and economic development? And let me ask the same question maybe in a different way, and you can answer it or not. What are you hearing from Latin American governments, whether it's Brazil or Mexico? I mean, Brazil has laws on the books that create challenges for free flow of data. So what are the big obstacles you think, or you hear back from different governments about the kinds of tools and techniques that Steve and Jonathan just talked about to create the free flow of data as alternatives to a straight and narrow data localization approach?
Maybe I'm going to sound a little bit too basic, Bill, with my answer. But the true thing is that in Latin America and the Caribbean, still half of the people are not connected. When you have 300 million people that remain offline, to talk about data flow I mean, is good, but we have a big challenge in terms of bringing connectivity. And when we think about connectivity, it is not just about how to connect the different households and locations that we want to connect, like, the hospitals or schools or any public institutions that we want. It is also about how we are going to improve the interconnection across the different countries. So the same way as we have physical roads between one country and another, and we talk about the Pan American road, we probably should start talking about the Pan American digital infrastructure, which unfortunately doesn't happen. And today, 83% of the traffic that is generated in Latin America goes here to the United States, even though if that is a particular traffic related to one content that is located in Colombia that is trying to be downloaded from Peru. So it goes to the United States. So there is a big thing related to how to improve the interconnection across the countries. And there is a whole issue related to connectivity and how to improve the basic digital infrastructure across the different countries. To me, that is the challenge number one. According to our estimation, well, the magnitude of the ticket is about $108 billion. Of course, there is no private sector capable of bringing so much money, and of course, for sure, there will be no government involved on doing that type of assessment. I mean, of investment, given the magnitude of the figure. So there is for sure a need of cooperation between the public and the private side, thinking that this is a decision of the country as a whole, thinking that this is a strategic decision of the country on how they want to move forward and become more competitive in an environment where, worldwide, the governments are precisely betting for this. We see what the United States are doing in terms of increasing the penetration in rural areas. We see what the European Union is doing, and also other countries like Korea as well. So still there is a lot to do in terms of digital infrastructure if we want to make sure that cloud solutions eventually are going to have a proper benefit and impact across different stakeholders.
A very fair point, Antonio. But Steve, it has me asking for you, because we have a question for you, because we've heard reports that foreign governments will agree to heavily subsidize basic connectivity infrastructure, as Antonio was just calling out as a core priority, that's adjacent to cloud opportunities or adjacent to other ICT projects. But then that puts global companies in the position of competing against a foreign government, right? Competing against subsidized economic development funds from a foreign government. So how do we get around that? And we got an audience question. I'm going to piggyback on top of this. If other countries are essentially taking a whole of government approach, in other words, it's systematic, and making kind of combined package offers to countries in Latin America, how does the U.S. government take an all of government approach to this? How early are we on in that? I mean, can state bring together, DFC and AID and commerce and all the many technical agencies that need to happen to get that basic infrastructure that Antonio was talking about?
Thanks, Bill. Yes, we've been, we have a lot of experience of this whole of government approach with 5G infrastructure security. And I think right now we're in the process of looking at those tools that we have for 5G and seeing how they apply to these other parts of the ICT infrastructure ecosystem. And we've talked about the similarities, but there are also differences in these markets that we've touched on. And so not all the tools apply the same way. But right now, we have a whole government approach where state may lead on foreign policy engagement, but we're working closely with our colleagues at Commerce in the Foreign Commercial Service or NTIA, as well as at the FCC with the technical expertise they bring, and DoD and Department of Energy and DHS, as well as other stakeholders especially ones like USAID and DFC, Exim Bank, USTDA. So there are a lot of folks involved in many of these conversations and looking at the various tools that each of us can bring to the table as we're advancing, especially 5G infrastructure security at this point. But I think we're going to increasingly need to look at what we can do in these other parts of the ecosystem as well, including cloud. And I guess as an example, though, that applies to cloud, we expect that the APEC Digital Month that's going to be held alongside the senior officials meeting, the third senior officials meeting for APEC in August in Seattle, that we're planning at that to provide a forum for APEC members and the private sector to discuss various digital economy topics relevant to them. But one of them, we're leading a series of cloud computing workshops in APEC that will help APEC economies better prepare for cloud transformation. And our cloud computing work stream is being developed with inputs from the whole U.S. government interagency, including USTR, Department of Commerce, and Commerce specialized technical agencies like NIST. And so that I think that's a good example of how we're already applying this whole of government approach to cloud.
Thank you. That's encouraging. I know on the recipient side, it's sometimes confusing because there's so many different moving parts and agencies within a single government, and not just on in this case, the U.S. side, but on the recipient government side. Antonio, you made some really interesting comments around, the lack of a single lead agency. So I think that whole government approach is going to be critical, both to make sure it's effective from the recipient government, but also to be competitive with alternative models and alternative approaches. So we're coming up, we have a few minutes left, so I'm going to take a couple more questions from the audience. We have a question for you, Jonathan. It was based, if I paraphrase it, is you negotiated the digital trade for the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. Did cloud come up there? What can be applied given that that's one of the most advanced trade agreements?
Sure. Cloud didn't come up specifically. It would be a covered service. And so there was a commitment not to discriminate against U.S. cloud suppliers. I think the big rule that's relevant is a prohibition on requiring localization of computing facilities. And one of the really interesting analysis on looking at the benefits of USMCA was looking at how that affected the financial services industry. Because Canada used to have a rule that said banks had to store their data in Canada. We said no, a bank ought to be able to use a cloud computing company outside of Canada under this agreement, and the Canadians agreed. And the amount of savings that were attributed to that decision were really one of the largest among the agreement. On the flip side, Mexico, which is also subject to the same rule, has put in place something that's quite unusual. Antonio talked about the importance of resiliency. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. Most major cloud companies do have lots of redundancy and backup data centers. What Mexico has done is put in a rule that says, well, if you're going to use cloud in certain financial services, you not only have to have a backup, but the backup has to be from a different jurisdiction, a different country, which never really made any sense to me at all. But the result has been that because cloud investment in Mexico is relatively nascent, but Huawei happens to be in that market, they've essentially been given a subsidy to offer services to the Mexican financial services. So that really made no sense at all. And I think they're very clever in the way they drafted it to not be directly in conflict with the rule. But that was an example of where cloud should have worked, and we didn't quite figure it out. And so we're faced with this challenge of having multiple services be required in a very inefficient manner, and arguably in a less secure manner, to be able to serve the financial services in Mexico.
Have those issues been raised in either under the USMCA specifically or under official government channels? Because you know better than I, the policies are great, but if they're not enforced, it's problematic.
Yes, they have. I think there's been some marginal effort to be a little more flexible on the Mexican side, but I don't think it has yet been resolved. So an ongoing issue that certainly industry cares about, and we believe the U.S. government does as well.
So another question. I'm going to go two more, and then we'll close. Antonio, what do you think is the single biggest obstacle to achieving trustworthy cloud in Latin America? Or you can turn it around the other way. What is the single biggest inducement or incentive to achieving trustworthy cloud in Latin America?
Thank you for the question. I think that this is very interesting because it is giving me the opportunity of mentioning something that actually is happening these days. You know, in a country like, for instance, Ecuador, we have been supporting them on doing precisely a due diligence process related to something that Jonathan was mentioning. I totally agree with him, which is the number of data centers that the different institutions do have. Do you know how many data centers, small data centers across different institutions has the government of Ecuador? No less than 60 we have counted. So going back to the question, I would say that one of the biggest challenges, I would say two bigger challenges. I would say from one end, I would say that there is like, again, a lack of coordination across different entities. And the best proof is that this, at the end of the day, implies a lot of inefficiencies that, it generates extra costs associated to the provision of those services, something that could be perfectly solved thanks to solutions like cloud. And second, is probably not only, as a consequence of the coordination, the lack of coordination, I would say that there is a lack of information that the different entities do have. And as a consequence of that, they are not, let's say, interacting and they are not interconnected. And eventually, they just think that it is safer for them to have their own small data center that doesn't have any security at all, neither from the standpoint probably of the infrastructure, not in terms of the redundancy that it should be required. And at the end of the day, this implies that we have like a number n of data centers that are isolated, that are not operational at all, and they are not bringing any benefit of what they were meant to be. And again, I'm bringing into the attention that solutions such as cloud could solve many of those problems, and also problems related to lack of coordination if we had a specific unit devoted to this.
Intriguing, and I'm certainly taking notes because I hope this call has been successful at trying to map out a solution space, different points that can be brought together as a package that could be tailored to different countries depending on their own priorities about what would make a secure and trustworthy cloud. So let me give the last question to Steve. What message would you really share to help us wrap up to partners around the world who are actively considering cloud infrastructure that might not fully be trustworthy? What would be your message and thoughts for them?
Well, I guess I think we've talked a lot about the security and the data privacy benefits that you can get from a trusted cloud supplier. I guess, I'd also note that there are economic benefits as well. And we do hear from companies that they pay attention to what the ICT, who is supplying the ICT infrastructure. So I think that it can be a benefit to attracting investment as well.
Steve, I want to thank you. I want to thank Jonathan. I want to thank Antonio. A complicated subject, but one that I think we're going to be wrestling with over the next years. And thank you for all your insights and suggestions. And I think there's a lot here that policymakers can follow up on and build on to help construct a more secure, economically vibrant, inclusive, and attractive cloud, not just in Latin America, but around the world. So thank you very much for all your help and all your insights.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you. Pleasure.
So much. An excellent report, by the way, Bill. And we do agree with your recommendations.